All right, since everything is getting quiet, I feel like we should start. Matthew has an announcement to make before we start. I think something about the termination of my teaching, but I'm not sure, so we'll just hear what he has to say.
I have no authority for that or desire. Just real quickly, at the end of April, Ronnie and Barbara Hunter are taking a trip to India to visit the church there, and a lot of the Christians there, and some missionaries there. If anyone has an interest in making that trip, I've heard it's an amazing trip, but please talk to Ronnie Hunter. It's going to be the end of April. India, if you've never been to India, if you've never visited Christians there, you can only imagine, but please talk to Ronnie.
And if you've ever been on a mission trip with Ronnie Hunter, that's just enjoyment right there. So, all right. 3 weeks left. I'm going to try to push through 2.5 chapters today. It should be much easier to do just due to the nature of these chapters. I did it a little bit last week on chapter 17, but I will sort of reiterate some of that as we go. Chapter 18 is one of the chapters in the book of Revelation that is the least disputed in terms of what it's about. But I think it is a fascinating study of God's view of nations and their socioeconomic culture. Because what we'll find in here is a strong indictment of God against a certain corruption that I think the church rarely talks about, and that's the use of wealth, and becomes sort of the primary focal point. Now, I've said this before, and I'll say it again, and I'll say it again, and I'll say it again. The Roman imperial system and the Roman religious system isn't the kind of religion that we think about. It's not individuals who sit around with faith in Zeus in order to save them from their sins. That's not what it's about. The Roman religious system was more of a socio-political and economic system that allowed Rome to unify their divided nation into sort of one ideology in order to bring them together as a unified nation, all focused around Roman ideology, Roman perspective, Roman culture, Roman way of living. And the imperial cult was the same way. The emperors didn't consider themselves gods. They thought they were, maybe in the sense that they were probably one of the most essential and important people within the Roman Empire. But they did so because of what it got for them and what it brought to them and what it did to the empire. It was the place in which Rome can find unity and peace and prosperity and a nation that was built on stability. That's what the Roman religion was. Far more economic, political, social than it was what we view as religious. And I think we have to understand it that way. And what John will do in chapter 18 is define the idolatry of Rome in a way I think is very relevant to our culture today. Because I think one of the things that we tend to do with God is we make him prioritize and maybe focus his anger and his wrath on the sins that we don't like, rather than the sins we are actually involved in. And what we'll find in Romans 18 is God hates social injustice, economic inequality, the minority oppressing the majority because they have wealth, utilizing that wealth for gain, for more and more and more and more. God can't stand that, inasmuch as he can't stand any sexual sin. And any culture that's built upon the concept of greed, this is why Paul in the book of Colossians says that idolatry is basically greed. And really what drove the Roman Empire was this: money. Money. And in fact, the very individuals who will be affected by this the most are businessmen. And chapter 18 is a strong condemnation against business people who all they can think about is profit. And there is no disagreement on that. But let's get there. Chapter 17. Now, I talked about this last week. We have these visionary experiences following the bowls, which are strong condemnations against the Roman Empire, in which God is pouring out his wrath on them because of the persecution of his people. And eventually, God says there'll be a day in which he will hold Rome accountable for all that they had done, and they will find themselves in eternal punishment. Those are the bowls in a nutshell. Well, one of the angels, in chapter 17, verse 1, who had one of the 7 bowls, we're not specified which bowl. And let me tell you this, if you want a good way to interpret the book of Revelation, go back to chapter 6, verse 10 to the 5th seal, where the martyrs were laying at the altar. And they look at God sitting on the throne, claiming to be sovereign, and they say to him, how in the world can you be sovereign if this is the way the world is? And Revelation is an answer to that question. Because I work on my own timeline. Because I am working. Because I am in control. You may not think I am, God says, but you are wrong. The world is moving in a direction in which God is intending for it to move. Nations are moving in directions in which God is intending them to move. And if you don't think so, you are wrong. That's what Revelation says. It is not just saying we are victorious. It is saying if your perspective of the world is that God is not in control, God is saying you are wrong. So then what, the martyrs say? What do we give our life for? And God says, here, I'll show you. Come, he says. But first, let me answer the question, how long do we wait for vindication? In chapter 6, verse 10, the martyrs say. And God says, let me show you. Let me show you what I'm doing to Rome. And he uses this illustration of, and I'll say it, this great prostitute, this individual who uses her beauty and allurement in order to draw people into her corruption. And what we're going to find out in chapter 18 is what Rome is doing to draw people in is the prospect of wealth, gain, stuff. And she sits on many waters. Now, she's not sitting by, she's actually on top of many waters, which we'll find later on in the chapter. The many waters are actually symbolic of the nations that Rome has subjected. With whom the kings of the earth, all the alliances that Rome have made as they went out and conquered the world. Now, this is another thing you have to sort of understand about the Roman Empire. Prior to the induction of the imperial system, where they actually developed empires, Rome had actually expanded itself through warfare. But somewhere around, in the early 1st century, they developed, they basically conquered all the known territories. They stopped going to war. And when you stop going to war, you lose one thing, income. And so they turned everything to taxation. They turned everything to trade. And in doing so, what these conquered nations were capable of doing and able to do because of the Roman system is they were able to participate that and benefit from it. But in the end, only a small majority did so. The aristocracy, the merchants, and they will do it on the back of the oppressed. And we'll talk about that in a minute because that will come up. And the kings of the earth committed acts of sexual immorality. And I'm telling you, porneia here is not actual sex. It is the allurement of this prostitute to participate in unholy and corrupt alliances that result in terrible, sinful, bad things, such as oppression. And those who live on earth will become drunk with the wine of what she has to offer. And at this point, John is carried away by the Spirit, much like Ezekiel was, placing him into the same category as the prophetic, the prophets of the Old Testament, into a wilderness. Here is not like it was in chapter 12, a place of protection. Here it is a place of persecution. And he sees a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, red beast, full of the blasphemous names, the titles, and the cries, the claims of sovereignty that Rome gave itself as the supreme control and power of the world when they know they are not. It is God. And he has, much like the dragon, 7 heads and 10 horns. They are the image of the dragon, the devil. Rome's power is diabolic. And I do want to do this in order to make sure you understand what I think the symbolism here, whether you agree with me or not, you're just going to have to listen to me. Is that the image is about to be expressed, there are several different players. You'll have the prostitute, who is clearly the personification of Rome, and more likely the personification of the goddess who represented Rome, Dea Roma, who was actually, images were placed in temple and worshipped in order to give allegiance to Rome. So she sort of epitomized the spirit of Rome. But the scarlet beast is Rome too, indicating sort of the different hierarchies or different positions within the Roman Empire, such as the emperor, the senates, the equestrians, the poor, the entirety of Rome itself. But we'll also find that the 7 heads symbolizes specifically emperors, and we'll see that in a minute because he'll explain this. And the 10 horns actually are the client kingdoms, the conquered kingdoms that are giving their allegiance to Rome through emperor worship, through basically participating in Roman ideology and Roman religions. And this is how it will break down. Memorize that. There will be a test later. And if you don't get it right, you can't leave. This woman was clothed in purple. And I know I talked about this last week because I talked about the difference in the biblical view of modesty and our view of modesty. In the Bible, immodesty is overdressing. It's what it is. And I can show you biblical evidence of that. It is not underdressing. Underdressing and nudity and being naked in the Old Testament and the New Testament has a different perspective. And if you don't get that, you'll miss out the intention of what he's about to say later on, because they will strip people naked because it is a symbol of shame, not a modesty. And she was clothed in Tyrian purple, the most expensive of dyes, where it cost only I think the riches of Romans could afford it. And scarlet dye, which is also expensive. And she adorned herself. She was alluring because she possessed gold, precious stones, pearls. Pearls were very much desired in Rome. And as a matter of fact, you can look this up. Look up Crassus. I think he was one of the most wealthy Roman individuals who would probably be equivalent to the billionaire today and just owned countless of acres and thousands of slaves. But there was one thing I read where people had become so rich that they would actually take pearls, put them in vinegar, liquefy them, and drink them because they wanted to show people that's how wealthy they were. It's like lighting your cigarette with a $100 bill. This is what was so alluring: wealth. And in her hand, she had a gold cup. And you would think what was in the gold cup would be something precious, but no, God says, because in the gold cup, there is nothing but abominations and unclean things. Now, the word abomination does not always mean sexual sin. Matter of fact, in Proverbs chapter 6, if you read it, it says 7 things are abomination to the Lord, and when it lists it, not a single one of them are sexual. It's a very broad term that indicates that which God hates. And on her forehead, just like on the forehead of the believers was written the sign that they belong to God, but here what is revealed on the forehead is the true nation of the Roman Empire. And he says what is written on there is a mystery, and I'm just going to go ahead. This woman is Babylon the Great. Babylon was symbolic of the oppression of God's people in the Old Testament, and in Revelation, Babylon is sort of that circumlocution where the word that is used to indicate something else, and here it is clearly Rome when we get to chapter 18. Rome is not just the great seducer. She's the mother of all seduction, because she contains the abominations of the earth. And the abomination that's about to be delineated is greed. And I saw the woman drunk, consumed with persecuting God's people, with the blood of the saints, that is, the blood of those who testified to the witness of Jesus. And when John sees this, he is perplexed. How can this be? How? I think sometimes when we think about John seeing all this, there's this complete understanding on his part, but many times when John and even Daniel and Ezekiel see this, they think to themselves, what in the world? How can this happen? And the angel says to him, what's wrong with you? What are you so amazed about? This is the way the world's always been, and the way the world will always be. Our culture is no worse or no better than any culture that has preceded it or will come after it. We just have different things we do wrong. And I'm about to show you one of them that we are terrible at in America. I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her. And I'm going to tell you about the 7 heads and the 10 horns. I'm going to lay it all out there for you. This beast claims authority, but he is a parody of God. He is a mockery of everything that God claims to be. The beast that you saw was and is not. He is impotent. Remember, these are the same terminologies that are used by God and Jesus in chapter 1. God is, was, and will be. He always is. But the nation of Rome was, but currently they think they are somebody, but they are not anyone. They are not. And they are about to come up, and the source of the Roman Empire's power is the abyss. The very power that possesses demonic. But look at what he does. This is the way Revelation works. As soon as an enemy rises up, what happens to them? They're destroyed. Their end is ruin, he says. Don't think any differently. Don't look at the Roman Empire and the power of the empire that it has and think that they're going anywhere but destruction. And those who live on the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life, anyone who follows Rome will look and wonder at the beast and think, what in the world has happened that he was and is not and will come? How can this powerful empire be so impotent? Now, here's where people will disagree with me. I don't care. Moving on. Just hear me out. This is what I'm going to say. I've said this 1,000 times in the book of Revelation, that numbers aren't literal. And up to this point, we haven't met a single number that's been literal, and I'm not about to start down that path with this. 7 is the number that symbolizes what? Over and over again in the book of Revelation, it symbolizes perfection, or completion, or that which is in its full form. And so when it talks about the 7 kings, it is sort of visualizing the Roman Empire in its entirety. There are individuals who try to sort of count out these kings based on Roman emperors, and the problem is no matter where you start, you don't end up in a good spot. In other words, it's not going to work out for you to try to figure out which emperor he's talking about specifically. It's not going to work. No one has been able to do this. No one, effectively. And I think that's a pretty good indication that God says, just stop doing it, is when you can't do it, right? It's like me trying to jump across a 50-foot chasm. It's never going to happen, no matter how many times I try. So here it is. The 7 heads are 7 mountains. Now, Rome is built on 7 hills, but I don't think that's what's intended to be said here, because mountains are symbolic of nations and kingdoms and powers. So the 7 head represents 7 powers, the completion of the Roman Empire, upon which the woman sits, Dea Roma. And they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 still is, and there's another yet to come. So what I think that means is this. Emperors have come, stood in opposition to God's kingdom, stood in opposition to God's intention. One now is doing the same, and there's more to come. And even after Rome has fallen, yet when he comes, he must remain a little while. And the beast which was and is not and is himself is also an eighth. In other words, after the Roman Empire is complete, there are still other empires that will rise up and stand in opposition to God's people, and they will all meet the same fate. Because no matter who stands up against God's people, they will all go to ruin, destruction. No nation can thwart God's intentions, even though it may look like they have. And from the perspective of the churches in Asia Minor, it looks like Rome has. But God's saying there is a spiritual reality here that you cannot see. Much like Elisha when he thought he was alone and his eyes were opened up and he saw the chariots of God standing around him. It's not going to happen. Now, that's the list of kings and emperors. You can try to figure it out, but it's not going to happen. The 10 horns which you saw, they're 10 kings. They're the client kingdoms who have not yet received a kingdom because they do not have the same power that the Roman emperor has. But they will receive authority as the kings. They'll have power, but only for a short time, 1 hour. And God is going to give them the freedom to express themselves, and you will find out that the client kingdoms that live under Rome have only one goal, and that is to get people to worship the beast. In other words, to get people to give their allegiance to Rome. That is the only goal these client kingdoms have, because if they don't do that, they don't get to participate in what comes in chapter 18. And this is a really interesting statement. Do I have it up here? No. And just listen to what God says about his abilities to control the free will of humanity. We often think that there are two powers in the world: God's sovereignty, free will. But the reality is this: there is free will that serves God's sovereignty. They are not equal powers. You will serve God whether you choose to or not. You just have to choose which side you're on. These individuals will wage wars against the Lamb, and the Lamb will win. Period. That's the way war is seen, spiritual war is seen in the book of Revelation all the time. They attempt to wage war, they're done. He'll win. Because he is not just the Lord, he is the Lord of lords. He is King of kings, titles in which the emperor would give himself, but Jesus says they only belong to me. And those who are with him and are called and are chosen are faithful, but will also participate in that victory. And he said to me, the angel, or someone, we don't know who, it just says he, some dude was sitting there. The waters which you saw where the prostitute sits, these are all the people that they rule over. These are the client kingdoms. These are the magistrates in Asia Minor who are attempting to force you to worship idols, to participate in imperial cult. But listen to this. And the 10 horns which you saw in the beast, what God will do is create division and civil unrest within Rome, and Rome will turn on itself. That is God's doing. They will hate the prostitute. Rome will hate Rome. And God will make that happen. And they will make her naked. Shameful. And they will eat her flesh and burn her. Burning in the Old Testament was typically only relegated to individuals who committed heinous crimes, typically of a sexual nature. It was what they wanted to do to Tamar when they found out she was pregnant. It's what they did to Levitical priests daughters who actually go out and prostitute themselves. They burn them. For God has put it in their hearts to do his will by having a common purpose, and that common purpose is to bring an end to Rome. Until the words of God be fulfilled, and the woman you saw is that great city, Rome, which reigns over all the kings of the earth. And after this vision, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. And he had great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. The presence of God was made known on the earth. And he cries out with a great voice, and he says, Babylon has fallen. Has it? No. But as sure as God says it, it is its future. Babylon will come to ruin. This is actually comes from Isaiah 21:9, where Isaiah is looking forward to the return of the exiles from Babylon, in which he says, one day you'll be able to make this statement, Babylon has fallen, because Cyrus the Great will enter into the gates and overtake it. And so they long for, in the Old Testament from Isaiah, the destruction of the Babylonian Empire because of its oppressive and cruel nature. But I want to make sure you understand this. God makes it very certain that they know that Babylon was sent by him. Nothing outside of the Old Testament is outside God's sovereign control. It was his way of punishing Israel for their corruption. But he promises what Babylon does will bring about their ruin. I've always found it interesting. God says, I'm sending Babylon, but I'm punishing them for what they do. In other words, he's punishing them for the very thing he sent them to do, which is odd. But God can do whatever he wants. I'm not arguing with him. And he cried out, all right, and she will become a dwelling place of demonic beings and a dwelling place of every unclean spirit. This is once again is also a quotation from Isaiah 13 after the downfall of Babylon, actually the downfall of Israel, where God will basically bring it to ruin and nothing will be able to live there but unclean animals and, in that case, satyrs, those shaggy, hairy goat men. There's demonic beings will dwell there. And every hateful bird, like a crow or a mockingbird. For all the nations have fallen because of what Rome has done to them. Rome has drawn them into the corruption, and they too will fall. But they're going to fall in a very different way because of the sexual immorality. And here it is. We're about to go into what we call laments or dirges, taunt songs, where it's very much similar to Ezekiel 27, where Ezekiel rises up a taunt song against Tyre as if he's sad that they're destroyed, but really it's kind of a mockery. And this is what he's about to do in chapter 18. But he's about to use three different classes of people in order to talk about the Roman perspective and what happens when Rome falls. For all the nations have fallen because of the wine of the passion and her sexual immorality. The kings of the earth, those client kingdoms who have committed sexual immorality, and all the businessmen of the earth, the merchants, the guys who profit from their excessive wealth of luxury, which they were actually able to obtain as long as Rome is in power. But as soon as Rome is in power, these business people are about to lose everything. And you really want to vote people into political office for financial gain, right? Don't we do that with the stock market? The people we think that will best support us financially. I'm going to try to get to 19 next week because that's really what I want to do. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, come out, leave. All my people, leave this culture. Leave Rome. And this is not geographical. This is, I think, ethical, moral, religious, and even your own economic perspective. Don't worry about what this is going to do to you economically, socially, religiously. Cut yourself off from the Roman Empire. This actually comes from several different passages in Jeremiah and Isaiah, but we're not going to talk about those because I'm going to get through this. So that you will not participate in her sin, don't become a part of her and fall into the same type of punishment, and you will not be punished by the same plagues, because her sins, Rome's sins, and we're about to see what they are, have piled up so high they reach heaven. And God remembers her corruption. And this is injury. A voice cries out from heaven, we don't know who, pay Rome back. Pay her back. Because if you don't have grace, you will have to get what you deserve. Give her back double. Now here, double could have several different meanings. In the Old Testament, it could actually mean to sort of create an equal pair. It could be that God just wants, some people think God wants Rome to be punished even more than they deserve, but I doubt that that's the case, because that's just not the character and the person of God, without even the entirety of the Old Testament. Because the concept of eye for an eye, tooth for tooth in the Old Testament, lex talionis, is not if someone takes your eye, you take their eye. Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, I think is very clearly, and I think I can prove this, if someone takes your eye, you have no right to take more than their eye. You stop there. That is why God holds people accountable in the Old Testament. For someone breaking into your home and you kill them, he will hold you accountable for murder, because theft doesn't deserve murder or death. Pay her back according to what she has done. Mix it up for her twice. Let her drink your judgment. To the extent that she, and there it is, to the extent that what? She glorified herself and lived in luxury. Isn't that interesting? To the extent that Rome built up her wealth and lived in luxury, give them an equal punishment for that. Let that sink in. To the extent that she glorified herself, made herself the best, claimed to be the best, and built and accumulated wealth, built larger homes, we're going to see this, had better chariots, accumulated gold. Destroy her for that corruption. And she will say in her heart, I am a queen. I am not a widow. I've not had a single loss in war. I've not lost my spouse. I sit as royalty, dressed like a queen, as we will see later, and I will never see mourning. And this reason, he says, one day you're gone. For in one day her plagues will come, plagues and mourning and famine, and she will burn with fire. For the Lord God is the one who judges her, and he is strong. He'll do it. Here we go. Get ready for the ride. I don't know what that means. I just say stuff. See if it gets people to laugh, to wake up. 3 dirges, 3 laments are about to be expressed here by John. He's speaking on their behalf. The first one is the kings of the earth, the client kingdoms, and what it means when Rome has fallen. The second one are the merchants, the businessmen, which is actually the longest lament, because they will lose the most. And the third, I think, is the sort of the entire maritime industry. Seafarers, businessmen who basically ride on boats, they'll have a part of that as well. But the first one in verse 9 is in the kings of the earth, all the client kingdoms who actually participated in this unholy alliance and lived in luxury with her. They're going to weep and mourn when they see the smoke. Now, smoke here isn't the punishment. Smoke is a sign of the fact that they have already been destroyed. Much like with Sodom and Gomorrah, when they saw the smoke rising, they realized that Sodom and Gomorrah had been destroyed from the burning. And look at this. Look at how much commitment they had to Rome. When Rome falls, where are they? as far away as they can, standing at a distance, because they are afraid. Woe, woe, the great city of Babylon, that strong city, gone in an hour. I have to look up here to remember what I said. And now the merchants. Here's where I really wish I could talk for a little while about a certain subject, but I will not. And the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn. Why? Because nobody buys their stuff anymore. Not because they've lost their idols. Not because they can't indulge in sexual immorality. They are weeping because they can't get rich. Their stuff is gone. Listen to this list, and there's a strong indictment at the end. Our gold and silver and precious stones. Now, the thing is, this was traded throughout the empire. A lot of this, they had to go to Sri Lanka, they had to go to Spain, they had to go to Iraq, they went to Chattanooga to get all of these items, all of this wealth that just poured into here. I mean, they were everywhere. This is why the merchants and the mercantile industry was so prosperous, because they could bring all this stuff in. But they brought it in and charged exorbitant prices so that only the aristocracy and the wealthy could actually enjoy this. And you will find a very strong indictment of the oppression that they utilize in order to make this happen at the very end of this list. And the last thing that will be listed is something that God will not tolerate, and I don't think we understand this. Gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, linen, purple, silk, scarlet, expensive woods, ivory. And you know, in Syria, there used to be elephants, but because of the ivory trade, they drove them into extinction. And if you read the Old Testament, God hates it when you drive his creation into extinction. There are plenty of ecological laws that say you have no right to destroy God's world for your financial gain. And one day I'll show you those. They are replete to the Old Testament. In every article of bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, and everything nice, incense, perfume, frankincense, wine, olive oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, cargo, and carriages. These carriages, the carriages that are used here are actually the four-wheel carriages that were driven by the aristocracy. In other words, you can't get your limousine anymore. You've lost your prestige in your mode of transportation. It's gone. I'm sorry. And it's all built upon the backs of what? Slaves. Not just that. Human lives. A phrase that comes directly from Ezekiel 27 when God condemns the nation of Tyre for building its empire on the back of forced labor. As a matter of fact, according to the Old Testament, Exodus 21, if you force anyone into slavery, or you even found in possession of an individual forced into slavery, you deserve death. Because God hates nations built on slavery, and he will punish them. And you better hope that you get rid of slavery based upon a repentant heart and not violence. Because God's anger and frustration may go on. Because God, I know it seems countercultural in the Old Testament and New Testament when there are so many statements about slavery, but I don't think we understand the whole institution of slavery and why people went into slavery in the Old Testament. And I know there are some complex issues, but I also understand that one of the ways, and I can say this, I'm trying to figure out how to say it. I'm not afraid to say it because I'm just going to say it. The way in which God tended to change social and economic institutions within a culture that were corrupt was not through open rebellion. It wasn't even going to the Old Testament and people saying, this is all wrong, you've got to completely change. Because remember, that's what he did with divorce. He didn't just say, divorce is wrong, stop doing it. What he did is took them where they were and led them into a very specific direction. He does so by enacting upon their hearts, changing them so that they can see the truthfulness and eventually revealing to them the sinful and the corrupt nature of specific institutions and acts. In other words, God changed slavery by changing the heart of the master, not through enacting laws. That's God's way of social change. I know there's Old Testament laws, but those Old Testament laws did not condemn everything that was wrong. Old Testament laws are not as detailed as you think they are. And I've read them. And some of them I don't even understand. And some of those Old Testament laws you would never in your entire life want to make a law today because they are terrible. And I stand by that. I would not give my daughter to her rapist to marry if I had her. So just be very careful with that. Rome was built upon oppression. And God can't stand that. The fruit that you have longed for, all this stuff is gone. The things that were luxurious and splendid, they're gone. God has taken away your wealth, and you won't find it. The merchants of these things who have become rich will stand at a distance, much like the others did because of the fear of the torment, saying, woe, woe. Seems like I'm reading the right things because it says the same thing. Because she who was clothed in fine linen, this seductress, this prostitute, Rome, purple and scarlet, and was adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, for in 1 hour all the wealth that she had was laid waste. It is gone. And every shipmaster, everyone who goes out to sea in order to do business, every passenger, every sailor, everyone who lives by the sea, stands at a distance as well, because when Rome falls, they have no friends, because it was built upon corruption and unholy alliances and greed, and that doesn't make good partners. And they will throw dust on their heads, and they'll cry out, weeping and mourning, saying, woe, woe, this great city. And get this, look at the irony of this. Over and over again, Rome is called the great city, the great city, the great city. But it's not. In which all the ships at sea became rich from her prosperity, for in 1 hour, God says no more. Now comes one of the most difficult parts of the book of Revelation. Our response to this is praise. Praise. God has destroyed Rome. He has answered the question, where is our vindication? But understand this. This is God's actions, not ours. God is the only one who can seek vengeance. The only one, not us. Rejoice over her. Heavens, notice this is the heavenly world. All you saints and prophets. This is probably sort of the glorified church, or potentially even those, because it is in heaven, those individuals who sort of lay at the altar, who have been martyred by Rome, waiting for their vindication. This could very well be them crying out to God, praise God for your just judgments, because you have pronounced judgment on her. Notice this, you pronounced judgment on her. Not us, you. Then a strong angel picks up a stone, a great millstone, and those weighed hundreds of pounds, and throws it into the sea and says, this is Babylon. In other words, this is the future of Rome. And they will be thrown down with violence, and they will never be found again. And in the city of Rome, nothing will be heard. There'll be no music, no joy. The business will stop. There'll be no source of food. The mill will no longer go. There'll be no normal activities, no lights in the streets. There'll be no marriages. The bridegroom, the bride will be no more. And all the merchants who were powerful people of the earth, all of it gone. Because you were deceived by her witchcraft. This is not magic. This is the art of deception that she utilizes in order to draw you in with the prospect of wealth in order to become a part of her environment, her culture, her religion, her political system, her social system. And in her was found the blood of the prophets because she persecuted my people. So note this, 2 reasons why Rome is destroyed. The persecution of God's people, and the greedful and corrupt way in which they accumulated wealth for the aristocracy and the oppression of the people below them. Social injustice, social inequality. And I do think we need to be very careful not to push that aside, because in the Old Testament, I guarantee you, God condemns Israel more for social injustice than they do any other sin. Because you have this small minority, this elite, who gains the wealth, and they accumulate, and they accumulate, and they accumulate, and they accumulate, and they never give opportunity for those people below them to do the same. And it doesn't matter what system you live under, we always have to go back, and I will end with this. It's God's parable of the rich guy. As he begins to accumulate and to accumulate, all he can say is this: I'm just going to build bigger houses, get more stuff. And God says, tonight, your life is required of you because of that corrupt attitude. All right. 19 next week, the good stuff, because we're starting to get into the positive things, I promise you. Although we got to get to birds eating people, but we'll get past that fast, I promise. The good stuff, the return of Jesus Christ, and then new heavens and new earth. And I'm going to talk about what I think heaven is going to be like. And I know that most of you will probably not agree with me, but I'm fully convinced we are wrong about heaven because we are not going to heaven. That's all I'm going to say.